Bob Rusk, it's so nice to have you with us here on Tuba People TV.
You have a name for this.
Yes, we do.
Well, thank you very much. It's my honor to be on your little show, Mike.
Thank you. Bob was a teacher of mine and Charlie Shuckett, who's off camera at Northwestern University, and was the tubist of the Milwaukee Symphony from 1970 to 1995.
25 seasons, yeah.
25 seasons. I remember when you retired, after only 25 years, you said, I've done everything I need to do in 25 years. What else is there to do?
On the tuba?
Yeah, on the tuba, in an orchestra.
Nothing.
Yeah, so that seemed to work out pretty well.
It may sound like a limited outlook, or maybe it's a limited career choice in the first place, but I've had the chance to play all the major works, usually more than twice, so you get a different viewpoint with different conductors. You get to examine the Bruckners and the Mahlers from different angles, and after you've done it 3 or 4 times, you know, it just becomes, you're looking for something different for its own sake. So I have no regrets. I did pretty much what I started out to do, and it was a gratifying career, and I liked playing the Bruckners and the Mahlers.
Well, I always enjoyed going up and listening to you in Eline Hall.
Thank you.
Play.
Thank you.
It's always an inspiring concert. Bob, you went to Indiana University from 1966?
1966 through 1970.
Okay. And there you studied with Bill Bell?
The redoubtable Bill Bell, that's true, yes. Fortunately or unfortunately, I had already started with Arnold Jacobs as a junior in high school.
Oh.
I had a little bit of a background and probably a little bit of an attitude, and Mr. Bell was not Arnold Jacobs, as I found out. It took me 3 years to figure that out, but I was studying simultaneously with both Bill Bell and Arnold Jacobs. Politically not a happy thing to do in certain cases, but from my point of view, it was an absolute wonderful experience to have the 2 major teachers of my instrument of the century to consult with on whatever problems, and it wasn't always the same thing, but there were many instances where I had Bill Bell's idea and Arnold Jacobs' idea, and I had to pick and choose which was going to be my idea. And I thought it was a fascinating and a very, very helpful. Some teachers demand loyalty from their students, but I don't know of too many good teachers who haven't had more than one teacher, and I think it's absolutely essential that you do have different viewpoints before you form your own. So,
well, Mr. Bell and Mr. Jacobs were friends, so there wasn't a...
Well, apparently, I think there was a great deal of mutual respect.
Yeah.
Bill Bell, of course, was the elder statesman, and Arnold Jacobs was the up-and-coming wunderkind, the virtuoso. I think whether or not they were close personal friends, in public they were cordial, they behaved like gentlemen, they behaved like colleagues. I have a famous photograph of them posing with their arms around each other, which in 1966 I wouldn't have believed.
Oh.
I didn't have that sense, especially in Bloomington, but they were both gentlemen, and they behaved like respectful colleagues, and so we'll just let it go at that. I don't really have any information to the contrary. I don't need to feel that because they're both gone. But it was touchy. I learned to kind of.
Well, certainly by the time you were at IU, Jake was past the wunderkind stage, and he had already established himself as a performer with the Chicago Symphony for.
Well, from Bill Bell's perspective, he was a wunderkind.
Always a wunderkind.
Yeah, but Bill Bell was, goes back to the 30s as the top dog, and then Jake shows up 10 years later, and. So I think that's more from Bill Bell's perspective than certainly mine.
Yeah.
And I think historically you could make a case for that anyway. I mean, Bell may have been, he was the first American-born, substantially American-trained tuba player to achieve the prominence that he did. And let's face it, he had a wonderful career. And then Jake came up in a more conventional, to our way of thinking, went to the conservatory, got training, started out in a smaller orchestra, worked his way up to the Chicago Symphony, and that is more in tune with the way we do it today. Whereas Bill Bell learned through the experience of being a professional musician. He was substantially self-taught. His Bible was the Arbans, and I think because he had no tuba teacher per se, he probably just assumed that he would compete with the cornet soloists of the old concert band, the euphonium soloists, only he would do it on the tuba. So you can be sure that lesson number 1 with Bill Bell was page 1 of the Arbonne's cornet method. And it was page 1 through page 10, perfect by next week. Okay, then we'll do page 11 through page 20 for the following week. Very inspirational. I suppose it was necessary. I suppose an element of discipline was imposed that has served me well, but it was not the inspiration that I was used to with Mr. Jacobs, who saw me sporadically and so generally kind of worked with concepts. He would give me an idea and trust me to go home and work on that particular idea. How I did it was irrelevant to him, as long as I grasped the concept and could put it to some use. So, I reported for duty as a junior in high school and was informed by my high school band director that I was going to audition for the South Bend Symphony a week from Friday night. And I said, okay. And then the best kind of audition, there was no one else there, but I was hired. And then I was informed the following week that, oh, by the way, you should be taking lessons from somebody better than what we have in our little town. And I've called a guy in Chicago, and it's all set up. You call him, and he knows who you are, and you make an appointment, and you go to Chicago and take a lesson from Arnold Jacobs. Fine, what did I know?
This would have been 1964?
1964, the fall of 1964. I was 15, I couldn't even drive yet. I'm up here, at that time Jake taught in the basement of his house on South Normal Street. That was a trip. Some of the older guys will remember that with great fondness too. But
What would describe the first time you went into that house?
they were very cordial. I was disappointed that he didn't live in a nicer house and his wife wasn't dressed in silk, and it was all out of kilter with the greatest tuba player in the world. And he came out, he had no coat and no tie. I think he was wearing slippers. Sure made himself at home in his own home. And we went down in the basement. He couldn't have been more cordial. He could have been more polite. Couldn't have been more considerate for a 15-year-old kid.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me so many helpful, here again we worked with concepts, with ideas, with slogans. There was no particular plan, there was no particular curriculum, no syllabus, is that the word that you use?
Very good, Bob.
It was Indiana University, 1966 to 1970. It was very much just this ideas, concepts that I was trusted to go home and work on my own with Mr. Jacobs. So there was a contrast in styles right off the bat. I don't think at any point with my work with Jake that there was necessarily an assignment for the next lesson or the next week.
Would that be all throughout your whole?
Well, the 1 year that I was in the Civic was the 1 year that I got the weekly lesson, and I still don't recall that there was any pattern, order. We had no idea where we were going.
You just showed up, started playing, and you went.
Well, yeah, but with him, and I learned this very quickly. He would always graciously offer you a chance to warm up, get comfortable, get the feel. Well, he was making his diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew that. And you couldn't escape his gaze, so you just played, and he would pick a topic on what you needed to hear for that, and he would talk for an hour. I mean, his command of the language was stunning. I've never heard a person that was so pleasurable to listen to. I mean, his vocabulary, the timbre of his voice. He was trained as a singer and did a little radio announcing, so why not? But I was always just so amazed at his skill with the language.
So you mentioned slogans. What are some of the slogans?
Oh, there are so
that you
many
heard?
of them. I mean, the strength is your enemy, weakness is your friend. The song and wind, or wind and song. I remember song and wind more than wind and song, but there were so many of those that were simple to remember, and yet when you went home and thought them over, the implications were rather profound when you tried to apply them to playing the horn.
Well, what did strength is your enemy, weakness is your friend? What did that mean?
Well, I think I started out as a cornet player, so I had a high C before I got my teeth knocked out. So I was very good at squeezing to get that high C on the trumpet, and that's the hardest thing I've had to do, is to get the strength that I don't need, the contraction of the abdominal sheath muscles, and replace the strength of contracted muscles with the freedom of motion of weak muscles. And that was very difficult to do, but in my old age here, I've gone back to a practice of the flute, and I've discovered that my fingers are a little stiff. I'm using a great deal more force to play the, it doesn't take too much to depress the key of a flute. And these are very strong fingers by now. I don't need that strength. As a matter of fact, that strength is in my way, and I'm trying deliberately to go to a much more flexible, lighter touch. And son of a gun, if my legato notes on the flute are so much better by accepting weakness in my fingers as my friend, and the strength that I would have on the tuba, it doesn't do me any good on the tuba.
I remember in my lessons when he would mention that, he would often use the example of the
bow
violin. Yeah, just if it's too strong, you don't get anything. If it's too weak, you don't get anything.
Well, the
Just
concept
that
of downward pressure
Yeah.
without motion, or you can substitute the pressure with motion, with very little pressure, and you get two different sounds on a stringed instrument, certainly. But there are a lot of people seem to feel the need to enter into contractile states in the diaphragm. The concept of breathing from the diaphragm, supporting from the diaphragm, seems to always involve strength. I've contacted one of the voice teachers in my town. I think I'm going to actually take a voice lesson to understand how singers breathe, because I'm a little worried that they don't require a great deal of flow or quantity, but I think they might go into some kind of isometric situation that I can't do, taking that from the singing world to the flute world, but I don't want to do that because it would be deadly for the tuba. So I have to be careful there, but the idea, the concept of strength being one's friend, give it some thought. There are many instances when you're playing the instrument. What was the idea of the minimal motor activity? Do you remember that slogan?
Minimal motor, maximum results.
I ran that past one of my MD friends, who's a very fine tuba player, Boston, Eli Newberger.
Oh yeah.
He'd never heard the word. Minimal motors is not a medical term, apparently. Well, that's all right, because there's one of those slogans.
Right.
And if you think about it, you can use it in your playing, and you end up a much more relaxed and a more efficient player using the machinery in a much more efficient way.
I think Jake just meant it, less effort.
I think it's more than that.
Less physical effort.
Yeah, because the physical effort always ends up getting in the way of the expansion of the lungs. It ends up getting in the way of the comfort. It contributes to muscular tension, which is never good on stage. There are a lot of reasons why weakness is your friend and strength is your enemy, I think. So one of those slogans, the song and wind, that reduces the psychology of brass playing to two very simple, very easily dealt with ideas. You have a song in your brain, you take in a breath of wind, you blow some wind through vibrating meat, and you end up communicating a song to an audience. It's sometimes a gross oversimplification, but as a concept, the simpler concepts are usually better adapted.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, let me. Well, just for the record.
Can you edit this?
Yeah, I'll be editing.
You'll tighten this up, eh?
Yeah.
Sit up straight.
Once a teacher, always a teacher, right, Bob?
So
He looks good though. With the funny light on him, why do I have to squint? Go.
I just am curious with your time with Mr. Jacobs. Did he use a lot of medical terminology? Was that about the time when he was studying medicine a lot? When did he? I'm curious when he did his work at the University of Chicago. Was that right around then, or was that prior to you?
It was right before you, as I recall. Would you say?
Do you want to wait for my response? It's my belief that was done in the early 1950s.
So a lot earlier.
Yeah. Phil Farkas wrote his books 1958, 1959, and that knowledge was already available to Phil Farkas. And I had the feeling that kind of research was done in the very early 1950s. So his use of medical terminology, yes, I was very conversant with a lot of those words as early as 1964. He, of course, was patient enough to either use them in context so I understood what he was talking about, or he would define it if you had trouble.
But when did he think about leaving the symphony to go to medical school? I thought he had resigned at some point.
I've never heard that.
Never heard.
That would have been so far along, certainly before they had the 52-week season, probably before the Reiner era, because they were just too good and too famous. So I was thinking 1940s.
No, I think it was, I had thought it was into the 60s
I
sometime, but
have no memory of that, but I wouldn't have known that.
Jake was, he was told in 62 or 63 by his general practitioner that he was going to need to retire because of his COPD.
He wouldn't be able to,
He wouldn't be able to
play the tuba.
But he had a doctor friend who was a tuba player. He was also a lung specialist, and he consulted with that guy just sort of off the record.
Do you recall a name?
I don't recall the name. It's on one of those master class tapes, either from
At the
IU.
University of Chicago?
No, either from IU or from University of Toledo. I mean,
Yeah.
University of Akron.
I have, no, that was not part of anything that I was aware of in 1964, or ever. If that happened, it would have been before that time. I know he had the interest in medicine. His father studied medicine briefly, and the Gray's Anatomy was lying around the house. My guess is if he ever seriously considered abandoning music for medicine as a profession, it would have been more like the 1940s.
Well, and did he have the skeleton and all the muscles? Did he have those charts in his basement?
Oh, yes, yeah.
That
We
was-
didn't have I don't recall a skeleton, but the charts on a big stand, and he could flip them.
Flip them
Yes.
and take the different layers of
Yeah.
the anatomy.
Yeah. We
What
didn't refer to that very often.
What other gadgets did he have? Did he have a
Well, he had the
oscilloscope?
spirometer. He wanted to know your vital capacity. He administered something at my first lesson called the static breath pressure test, which consisted of putting a little tube in the corner of your mouth, and then you had to blow as hard as you could, keeping your lips, basically the Valsalva maneuver that we're familiar with, and it would read out in millimeters of mercury, and it would determine how hard you could blow.
Mhm.
And I was a young, 16, I suppose, at that time. I did it, and I was squeezing and blowing as hard as I could, and I got it up to 50 milliliters of mercury. And he says, let's do this again. And he started insulting my parentage and my manhood, and asking me, are you sure you don't want to take up the recorder, honey? So he was motivating me, trying to make me
Yeah.
mad so I'd blow
Yeah.
as hard as I could, and
Yeah.
I never got it up over 60 milliliters millimeters of mercury. And he laughed and he said, well, that's all right. As a tuba player, you don't need to generate that kind of intra-oral pressure. And then he said, oh, by the way, Maynard Ferguson and some guy here in town named Lenny Morrison, who must have been a lead trumpet player in Chicago, were able to do 150 millimeters of mercury on the static breath pressure test. The implications there are some guys may have been born to play screech trumpet, and the other guys should have.
So as far as
Look
you
at the
know,
tuba.
he measured Maynard.
Yeah,
Wow.
and Lenny Morrison, and probably a few other people. And apparently some of us have the ability to generate a great deal of intra-oral pressure, and some of us can only do 50 or 60 millimeters of mercury, and some of us are therefore tuba players. You would assume that an oboe player who deals in very low pressure and probably low flow, but a great deal of pressure, would also have either the ability to generate higher pressure or a greater tolerance for pressure. But I don't recall that he talked about whether oboe players had any particular talent for dealing with higher intra-oral pressures. But on the tube it's deadly because you don't ever need that, you don't want it, it ends up in stiffness. And
When you were at IU, did you come up quarterly, twice a quarter?
oh, it was
Twice a
very
year?
irregularly, but it was probably more like once a month.
Once a month. Oh,
Yeah, I knew I had a good thing.
was that before the interstate was built?
Yeah,
Sorry.
we had to paddle our canoe up the Wabash and Portage. Yes, we had cars and highways in those days. There still isn't an interstate going straight north out of Indianapolis to South Bend. And that was my route. I would go from Bloomington to South Bend, spend the night, go up to Chicago on Saturday, come home, South Bend, and then go back to Bloomington on a Sunday and have my lesson with Bell on Monday morning. Having had a lesson with Arnold Jacobs on a Saturday afternoon. It was an interesting.
I remember there was you're telling one story about one particular trip to Chicago where you went to hear Jake
The
play
loudest
one
note in the
note.
world. Is it the Fairy's Kiss?
Yeah, Stravinsky.
The divertimento from the Fairy's Kiss. There's a fourth line F solo tuba, starts out forte and it crescendos, and on the recording it was phenomenal. I couldn't believe it. I suspected electronic trickery, and I saw that the Chicago was going to perform it live, and I literally left Bloomington on a Friday afternoon, got home, borrowed a car, went up here, bought a ticket, sat in the peanut gallery, sat there waiting for that one note. It was the loudest note in the world. And I went back to Bloomington with a big smile on my face. I mean, I guess they did other things on the concert that were good, and I hate to admit that I was fascinated by that one tuba note, but it was, oh gentlemen, it was a lovely note. Just that one note, and it was loud. So yeah, that's actually a true story.
When you were in school at IU, did you do much studying of the players via recordings? That sort of thing?
I did, but in those days there weren't that many recordings. It's not like today where everybody who has $500 can produce his own CD and does, or put it on the self-publishing on the internet. We had nothing like that. A major company had to agree to do your recital. So I think when I started in Bloomington, there might have been the Bill Bell recording and the Harvey Phillips, and then the Roger Bobo first LP came along. So when I left school, there might have been 3 tuba recitals albums available to me. There were more orchestral repertoire that had been recorded, and in those days the different orchestras had more personalities and there were more differences between the players, so you could learn a great deal by comparative analysis if you hear 2 performances of the Brahms second.
So you would study. You guys would pull out your LPs for the orchestral stuff. Study the players of different orchestras.
Yeah, very much. I think it was not, well, it was the tuba, but also I grew accustomed to the sound of the principal flute, the principal trumpet, the principal horn. Sometimes the recording ambience of the hall. You could tell that it was a dry recording studio, or Symphony Hall in Boston, or maybe the Chicago early Reiner recordings before they screwed up Orchestra Hall. You know, there was a certain sound, but there would be individual players in the orchestra who were so personalized, had such a unique personality that you could easily guess the orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
Today it's very much,
Yeah.
to my ear, not the way. Well, we had very little in the way of solo brass recordings at that point. There were some, but realize that only goes back maybe to the middle 1950s, and that was only 10 years before I got there. Totally different today. But I did do a great deal of listening in the IU record library. With what we had available, I absolutely listened a lot. My very first lesson with Arnold Jacobs, he told me 2 things that have stuck with me ever since. He told me, be sure and train yourself as a musician first and a tuba player second. Well, that's good advice. You know, we should study music and then we'll have our own performance medium. But I like the first part of that statement. Be sure and train yourself. I mean, Jake didn't learn all that stuff at Curtis. He had a curiosity, he had and the means and the wherewithal to train himself in anatomy and physiology and acoustics and everything else. So I've always kind of taken that at face value. Be sure and train yourself. And then he told me something else. At that very first lesson, he said, with a kind of a little chuckle, I remember that too, he said, although I'm considered by some to be a rather advanced player, he said, I still consider myself to be a student of music. And here again, he didn't learn that stuff at Curtis in the 4 years or 6 years he was there. I am still a student of music. I'm sitting next to the greatest tuba player in the business, who is a student of music.
And this was in your first lesson?
Yeah, 1964. And those 2 statements have been with me ever since. I mean, you're always a student of music because it's such a profound, I mean, it's an enormous world. And you never you can't quit being a student of music. And the way I see it, you really kind of have to train yourself. So those were very, very important ideas for me. I don't know that those were slogans. Did you hear those same things at any point, either of you? And those were almost his exact words too. I think I'm quoting him.
I guess they wouldn't be slogans. Would you? I mean, I think the sentiment was there, but
Yeah,
Yeah, well,
it was a little different.
you've heard that, the basic concept. Yeah. So that was has been very, very useful to me all my life. So I'm still, I'd like to think of myself as a student, and I certainly have had to train myself in most areas. So that was hugely important. That was the first lesson was probably the most important lesson of them all.
mm-hmm.
There were hundreds of them later over the years. Here again, they were mostly dealing with concepts, philosophy. He trusted me apparently he made sure that I understood his idea, but he trusted me to go home and make it my own. I would come back. He would never follow up. He would never say, well, last time we talked about this, let's hear it. He would never follow up on whatever he talked about the previous time.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a fresh idea almost every time I went in there, as a result of warming up and allowing him to make his diagnosis. You had the feeling some days he wanted to talk about something, and he probably would, if you hadn't shown up, he'd probably talk to himself in the mirror. But there were some days that you had no idea where he got that idea, but everything he said was so interesting, and it was very difficult to argue with his conclusions because he had so much proof. Very few teachers have that body of knowledge, of research, of science behind their teaching, and it's very difficult to argue with a guy who's got the facts and the figures. I referred earlier to the fact that I'm going back to a study of the flute, and it's making me crazy that the flute sorority, I call them now, it's hard to find a man who plays the flute except for me. They don't care about how they play the flute. They don't know what's going on. They don't care. They pick up the flute and they play the flute. It's difficult to argue with that point of view, but when you're trained in the idea of finding out what really happens, not that you necessarily can use that on stage, but I always found it such a comfort to know what was really going on when I did something on the instrument. And it's frustrating that the flute people haven't a clue and they haven't a care about it.
Is there any particular memorable moments about Jacobs as a person that come to mind? Maybe.
I don't have so many funny stories, if that's what you're looking for.
Well,
I had the
just,
opportunity on several
yeah,
occasions to spend the day with him. He would occasionally go up to the Holton factory on a Monday, and in those days the Chicago had a concert series in Milwaukee. So I would go down and meet him at the Holton factory, and they would take us out to lunch. We'd spend the afternoon doing tuba stuff. He would drive me back to Milwaukee. We would have dinner. I'd go hear the concert, and then he'd get in his car and go home that evening. So I had several of those days. He was always cordial and respectful of me, given my age. I never felt that he was in the least bit patronizing. And of course, it was a thrill for me to sit there and relate to the man and pick up little bits of knowledge. Not that I was trying to cage a free lesson. We were there as fellow tuba players on those occasions, and it was perfectly normal and perfectly comfortable. He was not particularly funny. He had a good sense of humor, enjoyed a chuckle, but he was not the first one to start telling jokes. Just a very pleasant companion on those occasions. Elder colleague, not really terribly preachy, didn't really want to give me a free lesson, but very pleasant occasions. I find it hard to believe that he actually went deep sea fishing. He doesn't seem to be that kind of a guy. And yet he had that terrible old swordfish, was it? Sailfish? In his house on Normal. You guys didn't go down there, did you?
I was on Maplewood, not Normal.
Yeah. Well, I think that fish was lost in the move. Unless it was in the basement. Maybe Gizzy finally got that thing out of her living room. That apparently was a fishing trophy from one of his trips. And if that's how he enjoyed himself, more power to him. But I just can't see the old man in the sea with the big straw hat, you know, trying to land some 2,000-pound shark. That just doesn't seem quite what he would do.
Were there any other besides the Stravinsky, any more memorable concert moments?
The Vaughan Williams that was done on the contrabass tuba.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that concert. I want to say he played that on 3 different occasions. I know I heard it twice. Once with the Bess and F tuba. I'm absolutely sure that I heard him play it on the contrabass, the York. I think there was one other occasion, and I just can't be sure. But I think
Did you ever hear him do a recital?
No. No, and I don't have any reason to believe he ever played a recital in his life, even at Curtis.
Just an individual concerto here or there.
Well, and the German band at Gunnison, he played the solo Pomposo. I have a tape of that. But did he ever perform the Hindemith, for example? I have no idea, but I don't think so.
He told me he worked on that with Hindemith.
Yeah, I believe that.
I think that's because he grew up and tubas didn't do recitals.
Well, he probably couldn't have put together a program of respectable music. I mean, that's a phenomenon certainly of my time. And I've had to borrow liberally. If you want to balance a program with a Baroque or a Romantic piece, you don't play tuba music. And he could have done that kind of a recital, but he was so busy with the orchestra, and maybe he thought it was a different kind of playing. But he always told me that he had 3 programs
Prepared.
Yeah,
He's
one of
always
which
working on,
was
yeah.
the long-term recital where you
Mhm.
perfect a small number of pieces,
Right.
as if you were eventually going to play a recital.
Right.
But I don't recall that he ever played a recital. They played brass quintet things. I heard some of those at Northwestern in the very early years, the 70s. But I don't recall any kind of a solo, no solo album. Well, they played a concert at the Millar Chapel. I think probably the first month I was in Milwaukee. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. So I came down, of course, and bought a ticket. And they came on, Chris O'Foley and Jake and Herseth and probably Vince Chikowitz and I want to say Oldberg was the horn player. And they sat down and they played a very conventional brass quintet concert, and it sounds like they had rehearsed Bruckner that afternoon, and they had dinner, and they were continuing what they were doing that afternoon. A wonderful section because they'd worked together. There was no concession to the chamber music medium whatsoever. Jake had the big horn, Chris was blasting away, Herseth was turning red. It was wonderful. Not to say they were loud and crude, but there was very little change from whatever they might have been doing downtown in the orchestra earlier that day. Very, very, very interesting and instructive. But I had the sense that they were so busy, and it was just another gig, and they had to show up. And they can't really. I never felt that way in orchestra, that I could be both a good quintet chamber type player and a good orchestral player at the same time. If I had to play a recital, I just didn't have a week or 2 off. And then once I did the recital, it's going to take me a week or so to get the orchestra thing back. It was very difficult for me to have both of those going at the same time. And
You mean a solo recital?
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
Yeah, it's difficult.
maybe that's what Jake was thinking. His bread was buttered downtown. He was an orchestral player. Harvey Phillips was doing, and Roger Bobo were taking care of the other end of the business. Jake thought he would take care of the orchestra end of the business, which he did.
We talked a little bit about Bill Bell and Jake. What do you know about the friendship that Harvey and Jacobs had?
We talked about that earlier too. I do own a copy of the Harvey Phillips biography, as he persisted in calling it. There were meetings many times, and I think Jake remembered that Harvey came around to the dressing room after the Chicago had played a concert in Carnegie Hall. This would have been in the early 50s. And Harvey introduced himself to Jake, and they talked, and in conversation Jake remembers that Harvey had an ambition to elevate the status of the tuba to an equal recital type instrument. He wanted to develop repertoire, he wanted to play recitals, and at that time Harvey didn't want to play in an orchestra necessarily. But I think there was some kind of friendship, but I think Jake was the elder senior member of that partnership. But if you read the biography, that kind of gets changed a little bit. And then when Harvey was on the Sauter-Finnegan band and they played up on Rush Street at the various clubs, you know, and Jake had a great affection for jazz and popular music, good popular music. So it's quite possible that Jake would have gone up and heard the Sauter-Finnegan band in one of the clubs, and they might have talked afterwards.
And there's a Sauter-Finnegan recordings with the CSO.
Oh yeah, the Rolf Lieberman. Yeah, those are very unsatisfying, by the way. They should have done well. Anyway, that's history. So yeah, there certainly is in Jake's background some affection and certainly an understanding of popular music, dance music even, and good jazz. And he would have appreciated at that time what the Sauter-Finnegan band was doing, and the Stan Kenton band. Any of those bands that were at that time somewhat experimental in their use of instrumentation and trying to do something other than the standard 4/4 foxtrot. So there was some interaction over the years. I never had the sense that they were close personal friends, but here again, as with Bill Bell, respected colleagues. Glad to see you. Might not see you for another 18 months. I'll be glad to see you then. You know, but
No, so Jake would just he had the air of being a doctor and really knowledgeable. But what if a professional, a doctor was there, he became.
But didn't you appreciate that? I mean,
well, I thought it was kind of funny in the case of my sister, but.
Well, yeah, but see that's touching, and I very much respect that in Jake.
Mm-hmm.
That the knowledge that he did acquire, which was considerable, and he was right. I mean, he would share it with you, but he's the teacher, you're the student, and he should be the authority or the dominant one. But he had the humility and the sense of proportion when confronted with a real physician who he wanted to learn from. You know, he was as interested in them as, I was going to say, the guy that came down from the Mayo Clinic as an amateur horn player. The man wanted a horn lesson, Jake wanted a medicine lesson. Mm-hmm. And that must have been a lot of fun. I don't know who won. But as I said earlier, when he said, I consider myself a student, and be sure and teach yourself, I think that was just an ongoing process with him to, when he had access to an authority, someone who knew something that he was interested in, I think he could very quickly show that kind of humility and that kind of, well, courtesy. I think it was genuine. Mm-hmm. As an amateur psychologist, I mean, he was the most effective. You know, he could trick you into doing things you had no concept that you could do.
Mm-hmm. It's just that I completely agree with you. It was just funny to see him change from this professor.
He became subservient.
Yeah.
Instead of the professor.
And you weren't used to seeing that. I wasn't used to seeing that, and it was like, oh, that's funny. I mean, he didn't change in my view.
Well, it was your sister.
Right. Right.
If it had been another doctor that you didn't know, that sounds totally like him, and it's touching to me, and I think I respect him a little bit more for instantly willing to be the student again. And I wish that I were like that, or I'm trying to be like that sometimes. He was an authority. Sometimes you have to pretend to be an authority. But, you know, if you actually believe you're an authority in your own mind and your own time, you know.
I was very happy during the last 10, 15 years of his life to see him be revered as an authority, whereas the first several years or decade or two of his teaching, he was more or less revered, or viewed as a bit of a strange fellow or witch doctor by the general brass community.
That's possible.
Was he viewed that way?
I think so.
As a witch doctor?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I
Steve Stewart tells a
wonder,
really good story about that.
when did his students actually start going out and getting jobs? Was that coincident with this time frame that you're talking about? And he was not, when he was, the year 1950, arbitrarily, he was not in competition with Bill Bell. Bill Bell was the king. Whether he's right or not, it's irrelevant. Bill Bell was number one. And Arnold Jacobs had to wait 10 years. When the Reiner recordings were released, and Bell aged, and so on and so forth, in 1960, Arnold Jacobs was the preeminent tuba player in the business. 1970, I mean, by this time Roger Bobo had returned to Los Angeles. But Schulte had come to Chicago. 1980, you know, who's the top dog here, and so who's going to get the good students, who are then going to go out and get the jobs and make the teacher look good? And the fact that Arnold Jacobs knew how to teach, you know, entered into it. But in 1950, he couldn't have attracted the same caliber of student in the first place. Curtis, you know, Curtis was a huge draw, especially in his day, because it was free.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1930s, Curtis was the place to be. I don't think it's like that now. I don't know where the great universities are, but it took a while for Jake's playing. I think the Reiner recordings of the Strauss tone poems and that first recording with Kubelik of the pictures. I mean, those are landmarks. Certainly in Jake's career, but certainly in the history of the Chicago Symphony. By 1960, they were the undisputed brass section in the business, and therefore, Herzog and Farkas and Jake and whoever else was in that orchestra, you know, they were the authority. And then Jake had done his homework. So, but anyone who was a student of his before 1950, 1955, I might agree with well, not witch doctor, but his students just hadn't had time to achieve prominence, attain important positions, and therefore make the teacher look good. I mean, you guys know what I'm talking about there. I don't really, but maybe you do. I have students like you. So he was an amazing influence on me in many ways. But I do, like I said earlier, the two pieces of advice. I am still a student of music. Be sure and train yourself.
Well, Bob, thanks so much for taking the time to
Well,
sit
thank
here
you,
and
Mike.
chat.
The water is delicious here.
Appreciate it very
Oh.
much. It's great to see you.
So that's a wrap, is it?
That's a wrap. Thanks.
I don't want any nuts. I don't want any nuts. I don't want any nuts.